Okay, this video is just going to give a few tips about how to read aloud, and these tips are based in the art form of drama. And the idea behind this is that if you are better at reading aloud, you can engage your readers in a way that makes them more able to comprehend the literature that you are reading them. In my experience as a public school teacher, I was trained in lots of different activities that you can do, before the text, after the text, to boost comprehension. And in my experience, you could do as many of those activities as you wanted, but if you read in a boring way, the kids are going to absorb like half of it. And if you just read in a way that was interesting, even if the kids were multitasking and doing something like drawing at the same time, they understood so much more of the story. They could retell it to you. They got like what it was all about. So anyway, I hope that these are really applicable and useful for you so that you can just be a more engaging reader, and it will be easier to learn from the stories because the kids are going to be understanding it. Okay, so tip number 1, and this is pretty basic, but for every new character in the story, you should have a different character voice. I used to think, well, I can do a high voice, or I can do a low voice, or I could do like different accents, like a southern accent, or a Valley Girl accent, or a British accent, or a French accent. And like once I ran out of accents, then I didn't really know what else to do. So like by the time the 6th character entered the story, I was kind of out of voices, and like the voices didn't make sense, because why would you have a French guy and a southern guy living together in a small town? Like, anyway. So something that I learned in my drama and education class that was really useful for me was you can think about voices coming out of different parts of your body, specifically your face, and that can give it like a whole new take that you didn't, like a whole new voice you didn't know that you could produce. Like, for example, like if a voice comes right out of the top of your head, it's kind of like a Julia Child voice, or maybe it would be good for like a fairy godmother, or something that's just really sing-songy, and every once in a while she sings. Or you can think about a voice coming right out of your eyes. It's kind of like Colin Creevy, and it's just so exciting, Or maybe a voice comes out of your nose, and it's really nasally, and it's just really interesting. Or maybe even it's kind of a really snarky, nasally sound like this. Or maybe the voice comes out of your ears, and it's kind of like an elephant, sounding voice. Or this voice that I developed for this wolf character in this story that I'm going to be doing a lot of modeling with today, I thought of it coming out of my chest. So I thought of it like as a kind of a gentlemanly sound that just comes right out of my chest. You can like just kind of pick a body part, especially around your face, and think about sound coming out of it, and it can kind of help you create a new sound. One thing to keep in mind is that the character voice that you decide on will directly influence how the listeners to that story view that character, which then leads into them finding the moral of the story. So for example, in this book, True Story of the Three Little Pigs, the moral is perspective taking and empathy, and many readers choose to give the voice a kind of a country drawl, because he lives with a bunch of pigs outside in the country, and that's a really common choice that's logical based on the setting. But I chose to give him just this very gentlemanly accent because I wanted my listeners to develop more empathy for the wolf and think, oh, he's not just some country bumpkin that is always getting into trouble. I wanted them to think, maybe he's sophisticated and educated, and he has real reasons for doing what he does, and maybe I should have more empathy for him, and have I ever really thought about how the wolf feels? So anyway, that's just an example of how the voice that you choose can directly influence how your readers view that character and how that leads them to the moral of the story. So that's tip number 1, is give every character a new character voice. Tip number 2 is to mimic any sounds in the story in your voice, whether or not those sounds are written out in the text. So for example, maybe if leaves are crunching, you can kind of make it sound like that. For example, this says, I rang the bell on the stick house. Ding dong. And like I added the ding dong even though it wasn't there. Or like right here, in the way that I read this, I'm going to create sounds that make it sound like he's sneezing, even though I'm not sneezing and it doesn't say to sneeze, right? I huffed. and I snuffed, and I tried to cover my mouth, and I sneezed a great sneeze. Right, so I just added a lot more sounds that weren't there, and it's really easy to visualize what's going on. So that's tip number 2, is mimic any sounds in the text in your voice. Tip number 3 is to add emotion. So if you're reading about something that's really exciting and happy, you can read it like that, and that will help your listeners think about exciting and happy thoughts. Or if, something is really disappointing, you can read it like that, and it will make the listeners think about that. For example, on this page, he says, I was about to go home without the cup of sugar for my dear old granny's birthday cake. And so maybe I would read it like, maybe I could add that little sigh, right? I was just about to go home without the cup of sugar for my dear old granny's birthday cake. So that added a lot of emotion there. Or, this would be kind of some sarcastic emotion. I would say, it says, can you believe it? I mean, who in his right mind would build a house of straw? And maybe I would say, can you believe it? I mean, who in his right mind would build a house out of straw? Right, so that's adding a lot of emotion. So that's that next tip, is to add emotion. Tip number 4 is to be conscious about speed. So maybe if something is really exciting, you read it really quickly. Or maybe if you're getting really angry and you need to read that part angrily because in the story the character would have been speaking quickly, or they would have been feeling quick thoughts. That would be different than maybe you're really tired and you really slow down, or maybe you're really sad or lonely and you would read those parts a lot more slowly. If a story is read at the same pace throughout, I'll just say it, it's boring. It's boring. If you think about like radio talk show hosts or podcast hosts that are really successful, they're successful because they're not reading off a script, and so they're talking at a regular voice that people actually talk in regular life, which has quick parts and slow parts, and there's kind of that up and down with speed that makes it interesting to follow. And I can always tell when they start reading off a script because their pace becomes monotone, and that's just the way that they read. And you lose interest really quickly. So I'm going to model this page, and you'll see how my speed goes faster and slower based on what's happening in the story. Okay, and it's this page. Here we go. So of course the minute I knocked on the door I fell right in. I didn't want to just walk into someone else's house. So I called, little pig, are you in? No answer. I was just about to go home without the cup of sugar for my dear old granny's birthday cake. So you can see, I started fast, I slowed down, I even paused. And my professor at college said that pauses can be one of the most powerful things in reading and in drama because it builds suspense, it makes the readers kind of stop and pause themselves to think about what's going on. And there's pauses in real life, so you can reflect that, like he was waiting for the door to be answered. And so there he was, waiting. So don't be afraid to add a pause. You're not in a rush to finish the book. Just make it interesting so the kids get something more out of it. So that's that next tip, is to be conscious about the speed that you're using when you read. Tip number 5 is to be conscious of your volume. Don't make it just the same volume the whole way through. It's boring. Have some ups and some downs based on what's going on in the story. Maybe if, they're angry, they're doing really loud, or they're yelling to someone from across the field, or they're so excited. And, maybe if they're kind of nervous, maybe they're whispering. Or maybe they just realize something that's so important and they're going to keep it to themselves. I'll just model a little bit right here, And I sneezed a great sneeze. Like, obviously that was appropriate because, look, there's, like, explosions and the house is falling down. And you know what? That whole darn straw house fell down. And right in the middle of the pile of straw was the first little pig, dead as a doornail. he had been home the whole time. So you can see how I kind of got quieter and kind of this angry, I was adding some emotion because suddenly the wolf was feeling betrayed that he didn't answer the door and he was lying. Anyway, so you can use volume. That is tip number 5. Okay, tip number 6 is going to be to add your own opinion as the narrator, your own opinion or bias. So maybe as you're reading, something happens and you really agree with it and you think, your listeners should notice that because it leads to understanding the moral. So maybe you do a little nod like, mm-hmm. Or maybe you do a little like, maybe you don't agree with it. Maybe I'm reading this and it says, the pig yelled back, "Go away, wolf, you can't come in, I'm shaving the hairs on my chin, chin, chin." And I maybe do like a little eye roll, right? That shows that as the narrator, I disagree with this pig's behavior, and I want my readers to kind of get a sense for that. Maybe right here I'm empathizing with the wolf. He had been there, instead of just saying like, he had been there the whole time. Maybe I'm like, he had been there the whole time. And I'm just showing that I'm empathizing with the wolf and thinking that the pig's behavior was unacceptable. And, the book doesn't say to agree with the wolf or to agree with the pig, but I know where I stand and I know where I want my listeners to kind of be guided to in the end. And you can kind of add your own little thing, like an eye roll or maybe it's a shrug like, and it just kind of is kind of adding in your narrator bias, giving them more to think about. So that's the next tip, is to add your own opinion as a narrator. Yes. Tip number 7 is to model your thinking as a reader. So you don't want your kids to be readers that just read something and don't think about it. And so part of the way that you can train them to be thinking about what they're reading is you model it. So maybe you're reading something and it's a really important part, and maybe it's one of those parts that I've suggested to ask a discussion question. And so you model what you're thinking by saying it. So you have to make it really obvious that you're coming out of the story and that you're not just continuing the story. So I would, stop your voices, look away, address the child, and be like, I was huffing and puffing and sneezing and making a real scene. Wow, what do you think about that? I'm kind of embarrassed for him, but I feel bad for him too. And all you're doing is you're demonstrating to the child that that's normal to do, to think, to form opinions as you read, and to just model that thinking. This can also be connected with a pause. So maybe it's a part in the story that's really, really powerful. Like, I'm thinking of, here, let me pause and get the giving tree. For example, in like the story of the giving tree, like this part, you're like, and the tree was happy, but not really. And you could kind of pause, like, man, I feel sad for the tree. Or even without saying that, you could just pause and just kind of look at it and, and then just keep going. And you're just modeling thinking for your kids. So that's tip number 7. Number 8 is to model drawing attention to the pictures in the story. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And especially with picture books, sometimes half the story or more than half the story is in the pictures. So, for example, Lily's purple plastic purse, there's some parts in here where if you don't look at the picture, you're missing half the story. You can see right here, the kids are yelling, "Yippee, fried cheese balls," and, all sorts of things are going on that aren't even described in the text, that you wouldn't get, without that. Or, let's see, this other page. There's like this whole letter written only in pictures, or there's, Lily, the text just says, Lily sneaked a drawing into Mr. Slinger's book bag. But you can see what the drawing is all about. Big, fat, mean Mr. Slinker, and you have to look at the picture to get that. Sometimes, especially like in Mercer Mayer books, the text will say one thing, and it's working against the illustration, and the illustration is telling the real story. So like, for example, in the story of, him with his babysitter, the text says, "I was very helpful for the babysitter." And the picture shows him, throwing popcorn all over the house, and the babysitter is rolling her eyes. And you wouldn't get that if you didn't look at the pictures. Another thing that's interesting, and it's just part of creating, appreciating the art, is sometimes in the illustration, there's just things that you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And like, for example, in Fanny's dream, in the clouds, there are like animals hidden in every illustration. Sometimes they're in the clouds, sometimes they're in the bushes, and it's not connected to the story at all, but it's just something that's beautiful, that the illustrator put in there, and you should just kind of notice it. It's just kind of part of it. The other thing is most children learn visually. About 40% of learners are visual learners. A lot less of those learners, about 25%, learn auditorily. So if you, are only catering to the auditory learners, you're missing, the primary way that all the visual learners are learning. So if you can train them by commenting on the photos, like, "Oh, did you notice the mice in that picture?" Or, "Look at what she wrote to Mr. Springer," then you can cater to their primary method of learning. Last tip, tip number 9, is to just practice ahead of time. If you can just glance through the book even, or I like practicing reading it aloud, that way you have a plan for, what your voices are going to be, when you're going to pause, what characters you're going to empathize with, what characters you think aren't acting correctly. Then it's just going to be a lot better if you practice ahead of time. All these skills are going to come out and actually work for you and work to help guide the kids to the moral, instead of, "I don't really know where the story is going and I hope we get there in the end." So, yeah, I hope that these tips were useful for you, and thanks for sticking around and learning them.